Excellent. Okay. Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. And a special thanks as well to Alex and Elena and Katrin Michaelsdotter, and indeed the Center for Digital Humanities and Art, both for their generous invitation to participate in this wonderful series and for providing me the opportunity to discuss some of my ongoing research here at The Ohio State University. In today's talk, I will attempt to address the elephant now occupying so many rooms across academic disciplines, industries, and communities. That is, of course, the proliferation of AI-generated imagery. Rather than treating AI as a distant technological problem, I want to focus on what happens in the moment of its identification. That is, what does it mean in practice for online users to encounter an image and declare, that's AI? That is what I'll be covering today, because I believe the initial moment of AI identification is where our human questions of authenticity, authority, and veracity become most visible. With this in mind, the talk today turns to a specific domain in which these dynamics are partially pronounced, the circulation of Viking imagery in online enthusiast communities, a decent enough topic for discussing this with a Center for Digital Humanities based out of Iceland. This may well seem like a odd case study to pursue. After all, what do Vikings have to do with artificial intelligence? It is well worth noting that the so-called Viking Age has, at least since the age of national romanticism, occupied a particularly nostalgic, volatile, and continuously contested position in the construction of national and personal identities. This pattern has not diminished in the 21st century, and indeed in enthusiast communities online, users do not simply consume visual representations of the past. They actively evaluate, contest, and negotiate them. Increasingly, they do so through the language of AI identification. Well, my postdoctoral project here at Ohio State University draws on a broader corpus of user interactions within such communities. In the interest of time today, I'll focus on a single representative example that typifies these larger patterns. In particular, I look at the patterns in public digital communities. For this particular talk, the public Facebook group Vikings and Shield Maidens, which some of our audience today may already be familiar with. As of April 2026, this group has a particularly large niche for Facebook community groups, comprising of almost 300,000 members, some of which I believe include some members of our audience today and the wider academic community of Old Norse scholarship. However, before I begin with my analysis of that group, allow me to lay some foundational background and define several key terms that are necessary for understanding the methodology behind this project. Since its release to the general public sometime in 2022, concerns surrounding the emergence of generative artificial intelligence in nearly every facet of modern life have, for better or for worse, now become commonplace. Perhaps because of this prevalence, a pronounced skepticism of AI, algorithms, and automation has emerged in common parlance both online and in everyday speech. We are now witnessing the rapid emergence of a shorthand language or shorthand language forms used to evaluate, critique, and dismiss AI-generated content, particularly within the linguistic economies of Gen Z and Gen Alpha vernacular culture. These are not merely stylistic trends, but early indicators of a broader cultural negotiation over the status of artificial intelligence itself. To illustrate this point, I'd like to highlight 4 terms that have gained popularity since the release of AI to the public. Those are bot, slop, clinker, and a more general term, that's AI. For the younger members of the audience today, these terms may already be familiar shorthands for skepticism and rejection of AI content, both online and in the real world. For the uninitiated, though, or at least for those not chronically online, these terms necessitate some illumination. The word bot is likely already a familiar shorthand to most of us for the word robot. But in recent years, the word has increasingly become synonymous with AI generated content, both because AI represents a type of autonomous robotic work that is distinct from human labor, and because progressively it has been semantically linked to the automated fake accounts of social media users, especially on platforms such as Twitter. Indeed, the word itself developed on Twitter in the 2010s to denote automated accounts, especially in the wake of the 2020 US presidential election, where Russian bots were accused of waging a propaganda war in favor of then President Donald Trump's reelection bid. However, in more recent years, it has developed its connotations as a dismissive term to delegitimize content users and their views by implying that they are inauthentic and automated. Even more significantly, it has recently taken on a role as an insult now levied at real people one disagrees with, regardless of digital mediation. Although Google Trends indicates that this word has had steady usage since at least 2004, with a dip in the 2010s, 2020 onwards has seen a spike in the resurgence of the word, suggesting not only a renewed interest, but a shift in its semantic function towards epistemic dismissal. Similarly, the word slop has received considerable attention. In 2025, Merriam-Webster chose slop as its 2025 word of the year, defining it as, quote, digital content of low quality that is produced usually in quantity by means of artificial intelligence. The American Dialect Society likewise made slop its 2025 word of the year, noting that AI slop had already been a nominee in 2024, and that by 2025, slop could stand on its own because AI content was often implicitly understood. Google Trends as well has demonstrated a sharp uptick for the word, or at least searches for the word, since 2025, reaching its peak within the past year. What is notable here is that although the term is contested and continuously negotiated online, the term has recently been inflected in such a way that it no longer requires explicit reference to AI to function. AI is already presumed to be present without explicit reference. The word clanker as well presents a similar but slightly different inflection. Merriam-Webster defines it as, quote, a derogatory term for robots and AI, one that is likely derived from a term used for robots or droids in George Lucas's Star Wars prequel films. Like slop, this term has only in the past year seen a substantial surge in searches and use, as evidenced by Google Trends statistics. Here again, we see the emergence of a vocabulary not simply describing AI, but actively positioning it within a hierarchy of value and legitimacy. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, is the rise of the phrase, that's AI, as a shorthand for dismissing content or statements as being illegitimate or false. Online, this term essentially means something along the lines of, I don't believe you. As Eric Morgan, writing for the consumer blog, for a consumer blog on digital advertising, noted in December 2025, quote, this is a crystal clear signal that generative AI, the very technology marketing teams are rushing to adopt for speed and scale, is rapidly becoming synonymous with inauthenticity, fabrication, and untrustworthiness in the eyes of the consumer, end quote. Taken together, these terms point towards something more than linguistic novelty. What these terms indicate is not simply a generalized skepticism towards AI, but the emergence of a vernacular practice of identification. This vernacular identification is one in which labeling something as artificial intelligence effectively functions as a way of evaluating its authenticity, credibility, and epistemic status. So with that important groundwork established, you are probably wondering, what does any of this have to do with Vikings or folklore? At first glance, folklore may seem like an unlikely discipline through which to approach a phenomenon like artificial intelligence. It is often associated with pre-modern traditions, oral narratives, or forms of culture imagined as existing outside of technological mediation. But this is somewhat of a misconception. As Lynn McNeil has succinctly defined it, folklore is informal, traditional culture. It's all the cultural stuff, customs, stories, jokes, art that we learn from each other by word of mouth or observation, rather than through formal institutions like school or the media. Just as literature majors study novels and poems, or art historians study classic works of art, folklorists focus on the informal and traditional stuff like urban legends and latrinalia. And excuse me, just very briefly while I switch my document here to hold this up. Excuse me. There we are. All right. Folklore is informal. It does not depend on institutions. It arises from communities in which in what we refer to as vernacular expression. Often, this informal dynamic exists alongside and in tension with institutional forms of knowledge. It is also traditional, meaning that it is collectively produced and emerges through circulation, repetition, and modification. If we take this definition seriously, then what we are observing in these moments of AI identification is not simply technological reaction, but a form of vernacular meaning making where users collectively negotiate the status of images and the authority of the claims they support. It is clear then that folklore is not something that disappears in the digital age. Rather, it is something that adapts. As Robert Glenn Howard has argued of online vernacular expression, quote, when the folk express meaning through new communication technologies, the distinction between folk and mass is blurred by the vernacular deployment of institutionally produced and commercial technologies. In other words, the digital does not replace the folk. It merely intensifies the hybridity of institutional affordances like algorithms and proprietary software with full communication, specifically in the context of communities online. Indeed, the call for folklorists, as Blank says, is, quote, excuse me, I've lost my train of thought. Here we go. Indeed, the call for folklorists to, as Blank says, quote, contemplate the myriad ways that folk culture in the digital age is a product of hybridization has only become more urgent as emergent technologies like AI continue to mediate expressive culture. What this means for the purpose of my talk today is that we should not understand AI as an external force acting upon culture from outside. We should understand it as entering into and transforming an already hybrid vernacular field. The flattening of barriers between the digital folk and corporate platforms has long produced friction. While early visions of the internet celebrated as a liberatory space, one that could, in Robert Glenn Howard's words, quote, wrest the power of computers from institutions and bring it to the people, end quote, the increasing dominance of institutionally funded platforms has rendered vernacular and institutional modes of expression completely intertwined. Crucially, users of these spaces often remain deeply attuned to this tension. They exhibit skepticism towards perceived institutional intrusion into spaces that are understood, whether implicitly or explicitly, as vernacular folk communities. This skepticism is nothing new. As Howard notes in his study of early web communities, even relatively minor acts of institutional moderation, such as the deletion of user comments, could provoke significant backlash precisely because they were perceived as violations of community norms. It is within this broader context that I situate the present study. I therefore turn now to the circulation and intersection of AI-generated or indeed AI-suspected imagery in online Viking communities. As I've already mentioned, the figure of the Viking has for several centuries now been a highly charged cultural object. In the present, it circulates within online discourse as a symbol of masculinity, heritage, and identity. And it is frequently mobilized within broader cultural war debates. However, my concern here is not primarily with these images as afterlives of the medieval past. Rather, I approach them as sites where the epistemic status of images, their ability to generate and promote knowledge of the medieval past, is actively negotiated. In online environments saturated with visual media, the question is no longer what Vikings looked like. It is whether and how particular images can be recognized as valid, authentic, or authoritative representations at all. This observation is the primary point I wish to make about virtual Vikings. I argue in today's talk that contemporary invocations of the Viking Age in digital visual culture are structured by competing claims about epistemic legitimacy and the epistemic legitimacy of the images themselves. Drawing on a corpus of social media discourse, I demonstrate that three primary claimant groups mobilize divergent epistemologies to assess, accept, or reject visual material as authoritative. These three claimant groups consist of what I term hypermasculinist identity promoters, historical accuracy policers, and heritage-based legitimacy claimants. And I'll come back to define those a little better in a moment. Crucially, generative AI functions within this contested field not simply as a representational technology, but as a rhetorical and epistemic resource. Accusations that an image is, quote, AI generated or slop, or the product of bots, operate as delegitimizing strategies, allowing participants to dismiss competing claims to authenticity by framing them as artificially produced, institutionally mediated, or otherwise inauthentic. In this sense, AI does not introduce entirely new visual tropes. Indeed, it often amplifies pre-existing motifs, but rather reconfigures the conditions under which these images are judged, such that the ontological status of the image itself becomes a central site of contestation. As a result, authenticity emerges not as a stable attribute of images, but as the primary object of folk negotiation. To examine how these moments of AI identification function in practice, I adopt for my wider research project a digital ethnographic, audience-oriented approach grounded in the observation of participatory discourse online. In other words, the unit of analysis here is less about AI-suspected images in isolation, but about the discourses that form around them within specific communities. This emphasis is important, particularly given that the example I will present shortly is not intended as an isolated anomaly, but as a representative instance of broader discursive patterns within the dataset. The primary site of this analysis, as I mentioned before, is the public Facebook group Vikings and Shield Maidens. This online community functions as a participatory environment in which users circulate visual representations of the Viking past and engage in discussions through posting, commenting, liking, and sharing. As described in its public-facing About section, it is a group for lovers of Vikings and Shield Maidens, a formulation that already signals a kind of identity investment in exclusionary politics that structure participation within these types of digital spaces. As such, it provides a concentrated site in which vernacular interpretations about the medieval past are produced, contested, and archived in real time. Vikings and Shield Maidens therefore functions as a participatory environment in which users circulate visual representations of the Viking past and engage in discussions through posting, commenting, liking, and sharing. To isolate the kinds of epistemological tensions I'm interested in, I employ I generally employed a purposive sampling strategy. Posts were selected from a defined period from September 2025 through April 2026 based on explicit engagements with AI, identified through keyword searches such as AI or artificial intelligence. What this method captures are not all instances of AI-generated images within this community, but specifically those moments in which users themselves identify, suspect, or accuse an image of being AI-generated. In other words, this method foregrounds precisely those moments of recognition and contestation I've already described. From this corpus, I've selected several case study artifacts and typified the community trends that occur within them, recording user comments and analyzing them to reconstruct discursive patterns surrounding authenticity, historical accuracy, and perceived authority. These comments were then examined through a qualitative tagging process with particular attention paid to how users articulate criteria for authenticity, how they mobilize external sources of authority, and how disputes unfurl within these community trends. One of the more striking dynamics that emerges from this data sets is that AI itself occupies an unstable position within these discussions. Users frequently express skepticism towards AI-generated imagery, associating it with artificiality, institutional mediation, and authenticity. At the same time, however, they often deploy AI-assisted tools, such as search engine summaries or generative chat interfaces to support or contest claims. In other words, it is, AI, in other words, is simultaneously treated as suspect and authoritative. This tension highlights the extent to which epistemic authority in these particular spaces is not fixed. Whereas AI-generated imagery is often rejected as inauthentic, AI-assisted summaries and search functions are often treated as factually legitimate. This instability is not confined to a single interaction, but recurs across the dataset. And it's precisely this patterned instability that the following case study I will present is intended to illustrate in more concrete terms. What I'd like to do now then is to turn to a specific artifact which demonstrates how these dynamics operate at the level of folk performance. As noted, this example is drawn from a broader corpus, but serves as a particularly illustrative case study through which to examine these reoccurring patterns. The image under consideration here depicts Donald Trump and Melania Trump, reimagined as Vikings and positioned in front of the White House while accompanied by the caption, "Just remember, the Vikings didn't offer to buy shit first." At the level of form, the object is legible in what folklorist Russell Frank terms news lore. That is, folklore that is, quote, indecipherable without knowledge of current events, and therefore structurally dependent upon referential density. In this instance, the reference is the convergence of Trump's rhetoric about the American annexation of Greenland, popular imaginaries of Viking Age violence, and the historical stakes of what exactly a Viking was. Yet, as Frank reminds us, quote, no piece of folklore continues to be transmitted unless it means something. A meaning not inherent to the object, but archived through circulation, recognition, and response. The analytic task here then is not to decode the image in isolation, but to trace how its claims to meaning, and more precisely, its claims to historical authority, are taken up, contested, and redistributed across the comment thread. Users register what they perceive as visual dissonance within their own frameworks of what the Viking past looked like via comments such as, quote, these two figures look like fantasy dwarves. That's not Viking gear. That's an ignorant person's idea of what Viking gear looked like. And more commonly and continuously patterned across this data set, comments such as they didn't have helmets like that. These are not discrete corrections, though. They are acts of reclassification. We might understand these reclassifications as a failure of the image to align with certain users' historical frameworks of expectation. The image attempts to operate within a historical representational frame, but is instead recoded as the product of fantasy or pop cultural understandings. That shift is precisely because of its epistemic status. Once the image is relocated into the domain of fantasy, the image is no longer merely inaccurate. It is disqualified from participating in historical discourse altogether. Moreover, it disqualifies the underlying political claim of the image, that is, that Donald Trump is not only a historical inheritor of the Viking past, presumably via the hyper-masculinist logics of the original poster's captions, but that Trump's claim to Greenland is legitimate. What is at stake here is therefore not historical correctness per se, but legitimacy. Does the image have the capacity to be recognized as belonging to the category it claims to represent? This question of legibility, as I suggest, extends across the broader data set, though it is particularly visible in this instance. These visual cues, embedded so heavily in pop culture and fantasy representations of the Viking past, are not themselves unique to AI-generated art, but are nevertheless consistently present even in simple AI image generation prompts, such as the one I include here. Having prompted ChatGPT to generate an image of a Viking, we see the same visual cues in this AI image as in the Trump artifact. That is, horned or winged helmets, fantasy-inspired armor, and hyper-masculine or martial imagery, such as the presence of axes and shields. There is reason then to argue such visual cues are understood as categorical failures and stabilize subsequent accusations of AI use. To quote several more key comments from this artifact, quote, well, the horns on this picture is their own and not attached to the helmet. Quote, that AI picture is way over the red line. And, quote, they don't even have horns on this AI slop. They have asterisk-style wings. Let's see. Other comments such as like hell it did, you shouldn't trust simple AI answers, additionally demonstrate the skepticism of the epistemological value of AI-generated content. Commenters of this particular artifact, though this trend exists throughout the community, do not identify the image as AI through technical verification, if such verification tools are even particularly effective. Instead, users infer the presence of AI from their perception of visual, ideological, and historical incoherence. This dynamic where AI identification collapses aesthetic, historical, and epistemic critique into a single dismissive category is not unique to this example, but recurs across the broader corpus. In this way, we may see a correspondence of the central affordances of generative image systems with this perceived visual inaccuracy. That is, while generative AI models radically democratize visual production, they collapse the skills of expert artisans and amateur creators to dissolve the barriers of who can produce visual content, and that they do so at a cost of semantic and aesthetic stability. By drawing from a vast repository of culturally inflected imagery of the Viking Age, and in recent years, being trained on already AI-generated imagery itself to create more visualizations, AI models inevitably end up reproducing repetitive tropes, anatomical distortions, the so-called AI hallucinations that we may be familiar with, such as multiple limbs, extra fingers, for example, and genre confusion. Commenters' use of the label AI therefore becomes a diagnostic shorthand for identifying the imprecision and conceptual flattening these models cannot help but reproduce. To call an image AI slop, then, is not just to describe its origin, but to render any further argument about the image's historical claim mute. What circulates in communities like Vikings and Shield Maidens, then, is not just the image itself, but the discourse surrounding its claims about what constitutes the Viking past, policing the boundaries of what constitutes legitimate representation and what must be rejected. This larger dynamic is evident in the emergence of the historical accuracy policing group I mentioned earlier in my talk. Comments within this classification include key examples that I've included here, such as actually they did so quite frequently, they traded before raiding, open an expletive book or read just one saga, how embarrassing. In addition to that, Vikings, that is that is pop culture for the uneducated. Vikings' success was largely based on fair trade. No Vikings ever worn horns on their helmets IRL. And my personal favorite comment, which cites Cleesby Vigvisson to counter the original poster's claims, Vikingur is the Old Norse noun referring to a Scandinavian seafaring raider, pirate, or adventurer, not a farmer like some has said, and not a trader. Although these interventions might be understood as mere fact-checking, I contend that they're doing something more significant at the communal level. Namely, they are performances of folk authority. By strategically mobilizing recognizable forms of knowledge, whether philological, textual, or lexical, these comments attempt to establish the performer's authority within a non-institutionalized space. As folklorist Andrew Peck has suggested, digital discourse operates within a mutually constituted feedback loop between technological affordances and social practice. The authority invoked here is neither fully academic nor wholly informal, but a contingent and situationally effective hybrid. In these performances, the knowledge of these historical policers is less important than the texture of legitimacy such comments convey. By invoking the language of scholarship, even if not directly quoting or referencing it, these comments signal their claims to expertise to others within the group. Authenticity here, then, is not retrieved, it's acted. A parallel epistemology emerges through identity-based claims. Comments such as a Norwegian, I find this offensive, or this is offensive to my ancestors, or Norwegian here with over 1,000 years of Norse documented heritage. I have only 2 words for this post and I can't post them. You know what they already are. In contrast to historical policers, in this epistemological, I should say, subgroup, authority and authenticity are not grounded in scholastic knowledge or its invocation, but in positionality. Following Andrew Peck once more, public displays of connection function as central mechanisms of identity work in digital environments. To assert, say, that Norwegian identity is to claim not merely affiliation, but privilege interpretive status. In a shift from the criticism of historical policers, the criticism of AI here is not that it is merely factually incorrect, but completely illegitimate. The sense of violation articulated within certain comments functions effectively as a rejection on the basis of cultural and group trespass. In this register, authenticity is inseparable from questions of ownership of the historical past. For this particular community subgroup, only those with Scandinavian heritage, or at least those who claim it, have the right to represent the past under any conditions. The third subgroup of this community engages the image through hypermasculinist or chauvinist evaluative frameworks, in which the image is not rejected outright, but subjected to an internal standard of masculine legitimacy. Despite the masculinist framing of the artifact itself, that Vikings never asked for anything before taking it, critiques of the image construct their criticism by relying on a criticism of Donald Trump's masculinity itself. For instance, comments such as, quote, Trump couldn't swing an axe. He would need a yes man to fight for him. Those poor feet with those painful bone spurs, so painful, not even sure which foot he has a problem in. Or don't judge these 2 people in, don't put these 2 people in Viking gear. It would be a bigger insult than swearing in a church. And finally, one of the more illustrative comments, unsheath your Twitter accounts, my fat ass keyboard warriors of MAGA. Tonight we feast on hamburgers in Valhalla Lago. The symbolic structure of these images here is not to displace or dismantle. The symbolic structure of these images here is not displaced or dismantled, but retained as normative. What is criticized is its figure's alignment with a masculinist version of the Viking past. Vikingness continues to function as the signifier of strength and martial competence. What is contested is not the validity of that symbolic association, but its applicability to figures like Donald Trump. In this sense, the comments do not operate as external critiques of the image's ideological premise, but as internal corrections. While accepting a Viking identity which encodes a model of violent and physical authoritative masculinity, it mobilizes that model as a standard against which Donald Trump is found lacking. In Frank's formulation of news lore, Frank's formulation of news lore becomes particularly applicable here. As he notes, expressive forms such as this image often function as parody, mock, or to comment mordantly on official channels of communication. But this mockery is rarely arbitrary. It is structured through recognizable ideological frameworks. What is present in this image is ridicule in the form of norm enforcement. The humor operates by exposing a perceived contradiction in the image's legitimization of Trump's claim to Greenland via conflation with the Viking past. The reference to things like bone spurs invokes a widely circulated narrative that Donald Trump avoided military service by claiming medical exemption, and thereby indexing a failure of Trump to meet the criteria of martial masculinity a Viking is meant to represent. Similarly, statements like Trump couldn't swing an axe function as similarly condensed judgments about his physical competence. Embedded within these jokes, however, is a latent epistemic claim. These comments assert that the image fails precisely because it fails to satisfy a preconceived notion of historical and embodied accuracy. Rather than placing the epistemic framework entirely as the other two groups do, rather than replacing the epistemic frameworks entirely as the other two groups do, this group operates alongside the AI image's claim. Its legitimacy is not in knowledge or identity, but in the perceived alignment between representation and embodied masculinist ideas. What I hope to have demonstrated through this example, then, is how moments of AI-generated visual content concerned with the Viking Age serve as sites of ongoing epistemic negotiation. Although I focused here only on one representative artifact, the patterns we've observed, namely the emergence of competing epistemological frameworks grounded in historical knowledge, cultural identity, and embodied ideals of masculinity, occur across the broader corpus from which the example is drawn. Critically, what I hope has been made clear, and what I hope is the main takeaway of my discussion here today, or rather what I hope the takeaway will be, is to reframe the question of AI-generated visual content away from the sense that the accuracy of any given representation is the most important factor to discussing this emergent technology, and towards a new formulation in which the conditions under which such representations occur contributes to the artifact's recognition as epistemologically legitimate. The identification or even suspicion of AI functions as a kind of epistemic trigger, prompting users to articulate, defend, and contest their criteria for evaluating authenticity. AI-generated imagery, or perhaps more precisely AI-identified imagery, marks the moment at which this apparent transparency of the image breaks down, and questions of what counts as real and authoritative are made visible. To conclude my discussion, what I believe is the crucial intervention within my ongoing research is the acknowledgement that the processes I've described this afternoon do not require absolute consensus. It is a field of ongoing negotiation in which authenticity is an emergent property of folk discourse. From a folkloric perspective, this is the most significant takeaway. What we can witness, even in this one example, is a redistribution and perhaps even erosion of meaning under the conditions of technological proliferation. Meaning is no longer secured at the point of production, but continuously reconstructed through circulation, interpretation, and contestation. In other words, AI makes existing epistemologies visible precisely because its own epistemic value has been culturally rejected. It is this real-time archive of folk discourse that underscores the continuing importance of digital folklore as a method for understanding how meaning, authority, and authenticity are negotiated in this present moment. Once more, thank you for your attention this afternoon, and I look forward to hopefully what promises to be a lively Q&A session. If you would like to keep up with my research or connect, you can find my email and professional sites listed below. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Where do we have? Right. That was really interesting. Do we have questions here? Somebody in the room?
No, but it was very interesting. Very interesting research. Looking forward to see the
Yes, absolutely.
duration of
Absolutely. No concrete questions, but favorable responses. Everybody here liked it.
Okay, well, good to know.
No, it was really like, I mean, like a couple of things, many of the things you mentioned, like are relatively, obvious in some sense, but I've never really thought about it this way, or like, like examined them so in detail. So that's about, created visual contents created by AI. That's very interesting.
Yeah, quite so. I mean, to a certain extent, this is sort of the nature. I suspect that some of the conclusions or observations don't strike one as particularly surprising in some senses, precisely because this type of folk negotiation, this folk discourse, is one that we're sort of all embedded within. We're all sort of participatory within it in our own sort of various sub-communities. And in that sense, I think the obviousness of it necessitates some greater attention. We have a tendency to, I think, to overlook it because we just see this occurring in our day-to-day life and our day-to-day discourse, as opposed to taking moments to really analyze, well, what is truly being negotiated, what is truly being said within this larger cultural narrative, what's at stake when we look at a AI generated image of a Viking, and what is a digital community's response to that, and does it vary by community? So my particular research for this project is looking at just this one enthusiast community as a case study, but there are similar studies and examinations of other communities that have brought up some interesting counterpoints. The work of Lewis Dean, who works for a think tank against extremism, and particularly white supremacist extremism in the UK, has done a more quantitative analysis of this material, in which he's revealed a similar type of AI skepticism in explicitly white supremacist communities on Telegram. And despite this larger conversation within these extremist communities of AI skepticism, there's also a substantial use of AI to generate white supremacist propaganda. So there's an odd tension at play, and it bears some attention. So what I'm attempting in my own project to do is a more sort of qualitative analysis of what this discourse reveals to us.
Right. Yeah. Okay, I have to admit, like one thing, like one of my first reactions, like when you showed that picture of the generated Viking, like you ChatGPT prompt generate a picture of a Viking. My first reaction was also, okay, why the horns? I mean, you would think that the ChatGPT is trained on a sufficiently large database, so factually, like they actually should have the facts correctly, and still they produce the stereotype of the Vikings with the horns,
Yeah, and this, oddly enough, the horned helmets thing seems to be the biggest visual cue that is identified within these communities. I mean, I don't think there is a single AI image I have come across in that community where there was a substantial, comment engagement with the artifact. where the horned helmet was not pointed out as being both historically inaccurate, but also a marker of AI production. And so, in that sense, there's a similar type of, let's say, symbolic flattening that's happening with a visual cue like the horned helmet. That I think is similar to terms like bot, clanker, slop that I started with at the beginning of the talk, in which inaccuracy becomes synonymous with AI and AI becomes synonymous with inaccuracy. And that blade kind of cuts both ways. But to your point about the actual like training of these models and why they continue to produce content that puts Vikings in horned helmets, it's a little bit difficult to say, I think, with any precision, namely because there's a substantial amount of opacity from these companies, whether it's Midjourney or ChatGPT or what have you, or I should say OpenAI or Anthropic, about what the data sets their models were trained upon are. But I suspect to a certain extent what's happening is pop cultural representations of Vikings were used to train early models. A lot of AI imagery was subsequently generated, and then future models of AI were trained on those generated images. So that sort of logical feedback loop has just sort of reinforced this visual trope for some bizarre reason, and it doesn't seem to be correctable unless someone explicitly states in a prompt not to include a horned helmet. There are even stranger visualizations that often come up within the data set in which the stable diffusion model, which is the usual type of model being used to create imagery, becomes quite confused about the presence of horns, helmets, and skulls. And so what it will do is remove the helmet entirely, and you'll just get visualizations of Vikings with horns growing out at the top of their heads, because the stable diffusion model has not been able to understand exactly what it was trained upon and just assumes that this must have been some sort of like natural thing occurring. It's really quite bizarre stuff.
Yeah, I see. So I mean, okay, that's obviously like the difference then, like on what kind of visual material the model was trained on versus what kind of text. Because I could imagine, like also had my chats with ChatGPT, and I guess at the propositional level, ChatGPT, knows that Vikings didn't actually have horns, because somewhere in the textual database there might be the description. Well, this is an invention of the 19th century or something like this. But then, of course, the visual material is such that most images simply have the horns because it's
yeah. And it's been adopted across larger, pop culture representations. One thinks of the very popular video game from a decade and more ago now, Skyrim, which has most of its characters who are sort of Viking inspired, running around with horn helmets. A lot of that imagery is present online, and I suspect what the models have been substantially trained upon. But it exists in other representations, both in Hollywood, more broadly across video game culture. So there's this sort of cultural inability to let the horned helmet go in some ways, but also it becomes this, I don't know, let's say almost like low-hanging fruit for these communities to identify historical inaccuracy, right? It's sort of the thing everyone is aware is a historical faux pas, but then becomes this tool for a larger sort of folk performance where stating this well-known fact is not really contributing any new knowledge, as opposed to performing that you are informed enough to be able to make the statement, to try to create some sort of authoritative credential within these larger discussions. And I think that's really its value within these communities. I think there are very few people very few users within these communities who legitimately believe that Viking Age people worn helmets. So simply like bringing up the visual air, the historical air, is more an act of performance than a legitimate attempt to correct inaccuracy.
All right. Okay, still no questions. Okay. Because I also think I've run out of questions. Anything you would like to add?
Oh, that's a good question. Anything else to add?
Yeah.
Well, so I guess one of the things, just to prompt very, very quickly here, for lack of a better term, is to simply say that so much of this material and so much of the discourse surrounding AI-generated imagery is highly contested, right? There's very little that has, and this is, I think, is no surprise to any of us who have been on the internet for very long. There's no sense of cohesion or definitiveness to any of these statements. Rather, there's sort of a continuous renegotiation of in this instance, what the Viking Age past looked like and who gets to be an arbiter of what that historical past looked like, who gets to claim legitimacy here. And so the important takeaway, I think, is to recenter our conversation a little away from the artifacts themselves, these AI-generated image artifacts, and more towards the discourse that is surrounding them. And I think that's where the potential for some really valuable and interesting insights exists. So I hope, at any rate, that I've made a convincing argument for that point, and I'd just like to thank you all once again, and the Center, for hosting me this afternoon and giving me the opportunity to present this research.
Well, thank you. I do think you made your point, actually. And also from us, thank you for presenting once more. It was very, very interesting and very revealing. Because then we have reached the end of our session. So thank you very much for coming today. And
thank you for having me.
With your further research.
Yep. All right. Take care. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. So.